Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Book Leads Impactful Books for Life and Leadership. I'm your series host and leadership performance coach, John Jaramillo. This podcast series is about getting to the books that have impacted the lives of people in my network, colleagues, new and old, friends, new and old, everybody throughout my network that's got a great message to share and tell. And these are great leads that I'll be interviewing on those books. I want to know which books they are that have contributed the most to their work, to their life, to their business. All those worlds are intersected. And in this series, I cover three categories of books. The first book that they're sharing with me that I haven't read, a second category where we cover a book that we've both read, whether specifically for the series or in our past lives. The third category of book is when I have an author and or publisher on to talk about the book that they've put out, the message that they want to share with this audience. So my guest today is Suzi Hunn. Suzi founded Teacher Thing in 2017 to help changemakers amplify their impact. Her specialty is designing education experiences that expand audiences and create income streams. Her book, Big Hearted Entrepreneur, is a practical guide for helping purpose-driven leaders own their worth and amplify a mission that matters to them. Suzi has more than 20 years of experience developing learning tools for nonprofits, social enterprises, cultural institutions, kindergarten through 12th grade schools, corporate groups, authors, and founders. As an educator at the Minnesota Historical Society, her largest project was coordinating the second edition of Northern Lights, a history curriculum used by 65,000 sixth graders annually. And other favorites include developing multimedia materials on Ojibwe, headwork, and Hmong immigration, and presenting at conferences like Games and Learning Society and National Council for the Social Studies. She lives by the rallying cry, "You have medicine that you must own." And she lives outside St. Paul, Minnesota with her partner and golden retriever. And I was introduced to Suzi by Nancy Berger, who was my guest on this series in episode 63, where we covered the book Tracking Wonder, Reclaiming a Life of Meaning and Possibility in a World Obsessed with Productivity. And that's by Jeffrey Davis. So please go check out that episode after you listen and watch this episode. So again, Nancy had connected us. Suzi and I spoke, compared notes on what our passions are, the work that we're doing, and here we are for this conversation. So Suzi, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. And I can highly recommend both Nancy and Jeffrey Davis. They've both been fantastic peers and mentors along my journey. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, John.
No, absolutely. It's great to have you here. So Suzi, how I always started off is asking, who are you today? Obviously, I read the bio. Is there a little more that you can give us on the day-to-day, what your work looks like as you navigate it? Just a little bit more on the work that you do.
Sure. So I combined teaching and education, which has been my longtime love, with my newfound love of entrepreneurship. So the way I describe my journey as a business owner is that I have always loved education. My grandmother, I just came across this article that was about my grandmother winning a national education award, and my mom was a teacher. And I've always been in education. And as you spoke about, I worked for 15 years as a teacher, trainer, and curriculum developer at a large cultural institution and major museum. And when I hit a glass ceiling there, I was listening to a podcast at the time about entrepreneurship. And I loved hearing stories of people using their skills from all walks of life, using skills in new ways and finding fulfillment. And eventually I became brave enough to start my own business. So Teach Your Thing takes education, combines it with entrepreneurship, specifically to help change makers. My people are leaders who want to make a difference in the world. I help them create courses, workshops, and talks that build new income streams for them, but also help them create some sort of larger social mission, because I am part of a movement that is disrupting the idea that business has to be only about the bottom line, or that if you're mission driven and you work from the heart, you shouldn't care about money. So I am really fascinated by combining mission and money together. And that's what I do through Teach Your Thing.
So what does teacher thing look like? What are the services? What does that look like when you're working with your clients? What are some examples of those services you provide?
I provide learning strategy coaching. And what that looks like is clients who have some method that they've already developed. And my clients are subject matter experts from all walks of life. So, for example, a current client I have is a hospital administrator, and she is a daughter of immigrant parents who did not speak English when they came to this country. And she knows what it feels like to feel excluded by the healthcare system. And now here she is, an executive, and she's passionate about patient care. And so over time in her own work, she has developed a method by which service providers can measure and learn about how to provide a more human patient experience. So she came to me because she's now at a point where she wants to expand that method more widely to other clinics and hospitals. And I'm helping her organize her content, put it in a container that her clients need, and make sure that it's relevant. And she is just really inspiring. So that's an example of my coaching. I also sometimes provide content creation for clients. And you had mentioned when I worked at the Minnesota Historical Society, I worked on a project on Hmong immigration. And then now fast forward to my work as a business owner, this is a project. What I'm holding up are student and teachers' guides about the Hmong in Minnesota. One of my clients was the Hmong Cultural Center here in St. Paul. And as it happens, the Hmong, a global community that came to Minnesota as refugees after the Vietnam War, has now grown into Minnesota hosts one of the largest communities of Hmong in the world. And so one of the teacher's guides that I wrote about and student guides for their museum talks about Hmong sports. There's what's called a Freedom Festival in the summer that's held here. That's one of the largest gatherings of Hmong people in the world. So I designed and wrote that content. Well, here's what I'll say. I am not the subject matter expert for any of the clients I work with. And what my skill is listening, hearing what's important to my clients, and helping them shape their content. What I'm good at is knowing how to make content relevant to a learner. And so I get to learn about all kinds of different content in my work.
Yeah, that's so cool because it's something that's transferable across any industry.
Yes.
Any industry.
That's true. And I also think that it's important to recognize where my role stops and theirs starts, because I do not harbor any sort of ideas that I know more than they do. I consider myself very humble and curious, and absolutely honor that they know their content inside and out. And so I ask a lot of questions and work in community with the clients to help them create. So it's not me putting my ideas onto their work, but I also have certain content areas or certain types of content that I lean toward. I have found that the more technical the content, the less in my wheelhouse it is. So I'm very interested in diversity and inclusion and leadership and empowerment and building a more human economy. So my clients are very, there is a through line there in terms of the projects that I take on. I really like to work for people who are empowering others and care about diversity and inclusion. And so, so there are some themes that I encounter more often than others.
No, good. We need that. You know, we need more of those people that do that kind of work, that want to change the world, that want to raise up humanity, community. It's almost like counterintuitive where the people that want to do that work sometimes aren't the best at communicating that heart, that drive, that passion that they have for it. Maybe because all the other technical areas they're so good about being louder. You know what I mean? Like it's mostly like the ones that are in the most human of work. Yeah, they tend to not be as loud, so it's like they need somebody that's going to help them tell that story.
Well, and you know what I find? There are two things that I have found to be consistent about this work. One is that my clients tend to have more to cover than the learner can take on. And this is I consider this a good kind of problem. I love that my clients are people who they have deep, deep knowledge and have built their lives around what it is they're teaching. So I love that. And that's one reason I enjoy being surrounded by them, because these are passionate people. But I often say, this is what you want to teach, and your learner needs this. And so one of the tasks I do is help clients figure out at the beginning, in a very strategic way that's based on their goals and their audience's needs, what's the right container to put this content in to deliver it for this particular purpose. And almost always that involves distilling.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing that always happens. Another thing that surprised me, though, is how often my clients, you know what, actually, I just lost my thought right in the middle. I was going on too long. It'll come back to me.
I'm sure it happens all the time to me.
Oh, good.
And it'll come back in the next couple minutes. I'm sure in whatever we're discussing, it'll trigger that thought back to what you were going to share. One thing that I did, and were there other areas that you wanted to cover, Suzi, on, coaching, content creation? Was there anything else that you wanted to share before we?
No, that covers
Which, I mean, hey, that's enough. I think that's a lot that you can provide to your clients. I love that mix of.
And in fact, I've even tried to simplify it more and more, and I'm leaning more toward the coaching as I move along. But yeah, it's
Why is that?
I've
Just
been in
because?
business.
Is it because the content creation is more time consuming? Why the? I'm not judging at all. I'm just curious why the shift more to maybe simplifying just the coaching.
Yes, you've hit the nail on the head. It's scalable, and I can reach more people that way. And the content creation requires significant customization. And I've tried to come up with ways to streamline. And I would need to either choose only creating certain types of content. And I am narrowing down. So, for example, one of my favorite things to do that I am continuing, even as I start to phase out some of the more complex, heavy, customized projects, are signature talks. Because I have found that it's a great starting point to create what I call a signature talk. And what a signature talk means to me is it's a slideshow that distills your key ideas and really helps you hone in a beautiful, professional, well thought out way that engages your audience and doesn't just vomit content at them. There's a lot that goes into creating a signature talk, but it's essentially a slideshow. I find that slideshow can be repurposed in multiple ways. And my clients have used slideshows as, well, actual talks. But then just the other day, I was talking to a client who said, you can't believe how many ways I have repurposed those slides as social media. He's like, this is the project that's just getting me 200,000 miles on the car that I purchased through you. So I love to help clients create a signature talk because they can then repurpose it. They can turn it into a video. They can break it up into micro lessons and present it as an online course. So that's something that I do like to create, and that can be efficient and save time, and it's also scalable.
Yeah, just because as a signature talk, you're hitting substance, but you're hitting like the high points instead of doing the deep dive into each one.
And that's hard to do. That's hard to, you're exactly right. It's not easy to do because, again, people who know their content so deeply. They've often spent decades through their personal and professional lives living
like those are
and
their
breathing
babies.
this work. It's hard to lead a learner through something in a way that does not overwhelm them or shut them down. And so we're strategic about that. And of course, one of the things we talk about is how big of a gap is there between your knowledge and theirs. And depending on where that is, we make different decisions. But regardless, you don't want to cram a whole bunch of text or even tiny little images all over a slide that are trying to portray like 15 points in one slide.
Do you think it's easier nowadays as opposed to like say 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, this field that you're in? Because then it was kind of like you had your volumes of books, maybe you had slides, and I'm talking like pre-internet, right? But now it's like you have a signature talk, follow this link to the website for more content. Then you have, scan this QR code and you'll get tidbits of this information. Do you think that makes it more complicated than it used to be?
I would say
Or is it a
in
benefit?
some ways, yes. Here's where I think, well, just like anything, there are pros and cons.
Yeah.
I would say the con is that it's easy to feel overwhelmed as a subject matter expert / thought leader / thought content creator. And there's so much pressure on businesses to be everywhere all at once and to respond with some kind of impassioned, well thought out opinion all the time. And I often encounter business owners who feel overwhelmed by trying to create in too many places, and especially when they're new to starting their business or they're transitioning their brand. I often say, let's choose very thoughtfully where we're going to start. And I'm not saying you can't be in 3 places, but let's pick one to start, especially in the case of a new business owner. So yes, I think not only the breadth of options, but the pressure and advice you hear from different gurus, like you have to be here, you have to be there. I make sure that my clients are very thoughtful about what lights you up. Let's make sure that we can choose a container to put this in that is not only valuable and easy to access for your learner, but also lights you up so that you can create over and over again. That's in the case of building an ongoing body of work, which I sometimes help them figure out.
Yeah.
But one of the advantages, though, of today's world is that there's opportunity to teach in what is known as a flipped classroom. I don't know if you know that term, but it's an instructional design term that I believe was developed in the kindergarten through K-12 world. But what a flipped classroom is something that I often tell clients, you know about this, you just don't, the term is new to you, but the concept is not. Basically what it means is I, as a Gen X woman, grew up in a world where a classroom meant when we're together in a group, the instructor is up in front of the class and delivering content. Then the students disperse. I go home now as a student, I'm doing my homework and I'm wrestling with the problem. I'm wrestling with the content. And I may be by myself. I may be with a parent who doesn't know the content. And that's what I would call a traditional classroom. Now, in today's world where technology is ubiquitous, we can implement what's called a flipped classroom, which is you just flip those roles. Now we can deliver the lecture part as a video so that as a student of a class, I can encounter the lecture on my own time. I can watch a video at 2 a.m. if I want to. Then we take the time together. Now I'm with my facilitator, my instructor, and the other students. We can wrestle with the problem, do our homework together. And that's something that I often help clients think about is how can you create an opportunity to maximize your time with your people and deliver your content in other ways? So that's a real opportunity that provides powerful learning experiences.
Yeah, see that? I like that flipped concept, especially because I think the most important part that a facilitator, an instructor, a teacher, I think the most important part that they need to be around for and really focus on and spend some time in is the thinking part, is the conversational aspect. Um, I'm over the traditional, lecture, 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 go home, do homework. Like, I like the way that you're sharing it, that flipped concept where it's like you watch a video, what are your takeaways? And I'll come in and we're going to discuss it. Because to me, we don't teach enough about conversation. I don't think we model it enough for students. Again, I've been out of school myself. I graduated graduate school maybe 10 years ago, high school. I don't want to go into how long ago that was. For me, I just remember it was just always constant information. Here's more information. Study it. We're going to test you. You're going to write a research paper on it, a thesis, whatever it may be. But there wasn't enough conversation. That's why I enjoyed and did better in graduate school, because there was a little more taste for that conversation. How are we going to break that down? But I think there's room and need to do it even more, because obviously, it's evidence in just what you see in society. We don't know how to talk to each other. We don't know how to teach each other. We don't know how to listen to each other. So anything that kind of models that, especially at my young boys, and my daughter's too, she's not in that environment yet, but my 8 and my 5-year-old, if they can start getting in that habit of understanding how to see something and then be able to, okay, bring your best ideas, your best questions, your best challenges about what you saw. That's what I want, that critical thinking to start at that young age. So I love that concept.
Well, and I would hope that they get to encounter exciting learning techniques that weren't really around when we were their age. I imagine
Yeah.
you'll see more of that. Although the K-12 world does tend to trail innovation of other industries, but I'm sure they're going to have a lot of exciting opportunities and ways to engage. Like, I'm going off on a tangent, but I'll just say briefly,
I love
your
tangents.
kids are more likely to encounter gaming in their learning, which is really
Yeah.
exciting to me too.
Yeah. And I mean, what I just shared about the grievances I had maybe with my educational system or upbringing is no judgment on what they're doing now, because visiting their classroom, talking to their teachers, the access that we have to their instructors, it's a whole entirely different world. And I mean, the teachers are younger, so I mean they're into those more innovative, efficient ways of approaching a conversation and teaching. So it's a completely different world. Susie, before we move into, were you going to say something?
Well, I wanted to say, if any of your listeners are creating a talk or a course, I would encourage them to build space into whatever they're designing for that engagement. And one of the guidelines I use as a starting point is to say, whatever the scope is of your learning, what would it look like if half of that were devoted to audience interaction? So let's say you're doing a 90-minute talk. Think about 45 minutes of that being engaging your people. So just something for your people to think about. And I love this phrase that I learned when I was a learning manager in a corporate headquarters. What they said was, the person doing the talking is the person doing the learning. So think about that if any of your listeners are creating some sort of learning experience.
Can you go into that a little more? What does that mean to you when they say the person doing the talking is the person doing the learning?
What that means to me is, if you have something important you want to teach, don't think that your learners need you to just lecture at them. What they need is an opportunity to think it through, to speak out loud how they connect to it. And it reminds me of what you were saying about your grievances of your own education experiences. If an instructor thinks that their role is to simply impart wisdom, I think they're missing an opportunity to tap into the power that is right there among you with your students. And so that can take a lot of different forms, and this is where distilling content comes in. I help my clients think through, okay, in the container that we're developing, what does providing space for your learners to engage look like? So let's say a lot of my clients are designing online courses or memberships. That can look like an online forum. So that doesn't necessarily only have to take away from lecture time, but it can also look like, instead of, if you're going to meet weekly with a group online, don't take that entire, let's say you meet for 50 minutes online. I would encourage you not to use that 50 minutes to just lecture. Come up with a compelling prompt that's directly related to what you want to teach, that will have relevance in your learners' lives right now. Ask questions and then come up with a targeted way to facilitate, here's how I'm going to get you guys to wrestle through this question and support each other.
Yeah.
That's where the power comes in.
Yeah, when you mentioned that quote, that phrase, that's what I kind of took away is, even though you're the one in the teaching position per se, you should look for engagement and conversation that's going to question, that's going to help you sharpen your own understanding, maybe see it a different way. People can always come back with their own tones and experiences, with questions, comments, suggestions, recommendations, challenges that I know, for instance, when I give a presentation, say in a year, I'll give the same presentation maybe to 6, 7 different bodies, from students to corporations. And that presentation, the way that I present it, changes from time to time because of that conversation that I've had with people in the previous sessions, questions they've had, challenges they had, everything I listed, all the things. So now the next time I go in, I don't stick to the same stamp that it sounds the same every time, because even if I didn't have that feedback from one audience, my own experiences between presentations craft and shape how I view the material. So when you mentioned that phrase, that's what came to mind, where the teacher is the learner. So I appreciate that. I love that. And
Well,
Susie,
I'm
one more.
cheering you on.
Yeah,
Good for you.
I
I'm glad
appreciate
you
that.
do that.
And I was going to ask, from the bio, what the mantra, "You have medicine that you must own." What does that mean? Where did you get that? What does it mean to you?
Thanks for asking about that. I got that actually from a workshop I took from Jeffrey Davis, who you mentioned at the top of this conversation. But what it means to me is, each of us, and I believe this applies to every human being. We all have unique medicine that can help other people through our own lived experience, through our own natural talents, through our own perspective. If we are in touch with and can figure out how to use our own gifts, we can provide that as medicine to others. And that might sound kind of woo-woo. And by the way, on the spectrum of scientific to woo-woo, I'm kind of in the middle. I have some room. I am very much a believer in science, but I believe in spirituality too. And so I think there's a spiritual nature to what I'm talking about. But when it comes to using your gifts, I think a lot of us are not owning what our true gifts are. And there are a lot of reasons why that can be. We live in a society that is patriarchal. There's plenty of racism. There are lots of things that are keeping various groups down or keeping individuals down. And so for many reasons, we might not be owning what our true medicine is. And it's scary and vulnerable to do that. And so I love helping people who have a drive to support others channel that medicines, because sometimes you're not owning your medicine because someone else is keeping you from it. Sometimes you're not owning your medicine because you don't have a formal structure for it. And that's where I help clients with instructional design. So I just love to help people light up and light others up.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing phrase, an amazing idea, and yeah, you see it every day. Um, God, that could be a completely different episode just talking about that and what people give up on in themselves. As young as grammar school because they're around the wrong people, they take it to heart and they shut down a piece of them. You know, I tend to think that education, I don't know what it is now, what it's like now, but it kind of gets us all to be the same and we give up our unique gifts because we're kind of indoctrinated in a way, just in
Mhm.
education, not in any particular philosophy. Everybody has to get high grades, everybody has to study these particular things. So that's fascinating. But
You
okay.
bring up you bring up a good point too about in business in particular. Um, we used to be in a mass market economy where the scenario you just described
Mhm.
was um, in order to fit in order to succeed, you had to fit in and you had to try to reach everyone with your product or service. But now we are living in a niche economy where, because of globalization, because of hyperconnectedness and technology, we can find our unique people anywhere across the globe. So, trying to use mass market economy ideas to run a business
Mm.
now can be problematic, I think. But then again, I'm a small business owner too, so that's been the
No,
case
but
for
but
my
there
clients.
is there is something to that. I mean, I think with the proliferation of social media the last, I don't know, at this point almost 20 years, everybody can put out their voice, what they're into, what they're not into, and we've realized how different people really are. I think that's in our era of existence. I think that the proliferation of social media is going to show that turning point of, okay, we were all doing kind of the similar things and everybody was in their script and um, another brick in a wall kind of thing. And then you get social media where everybody can have a different voice. Everybody can show different things about themselves. People are making money in that fashion. So that's where it's kind of break off. So it's a very important marker, I think, just
Mhm.
social media and what it's done for learning just in general about each other and ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I just thought of a quick side note.
Sure.
Just to close a loop from earlier in the conversation, I remember the thing that surprised me
I
about
told you.
many of my clients, which is that I thought that I would be supporting leaders who were not good at teaching. But what I've found is most of my clients actually are naturals at it. And they're people who love educating. They have a good knack for it and they're
Mhm.
doing a good job. So that surprised me. But it's fun to me to get to surround myself with these people who are really good educators naturally. And I can certainly help them refine their craft of educating, but my clients are all pretty good at it to start, and that's been kind of a fun surprise.
Okay.
Thanks
No,
for
that
letting
makes
me
sense. That
get
that
that in
makes
there.
sense. Um, yeah, because I didn't know how much of it would be like how much of it would be somebody well, I guess if somebody's reaching out to you, it's because they generally have that desire to teach. As opposed to if a company said, "Hey, can you work with this leader?" and that leader is kind of not into it. Do you come across those situations at all?
I don't, and I think
Okay.
part of that is because of my own branding. I'm very clear about my messaging and my tone. I put a very warm, specific type of point of view into the world, and I attract people who resonate with that. And so I'm trying to think. I don't know that I've ever encountered a client who just is very opposed to educating or not really naturals at it. But that again surprised me. I thought that I would be doing a lot more getting people to believe in the
Mm.
philosophies that I share about educating, but that has
Meanwhile, they
rarely occurred.
already have that general appreciation for it. They just need the specific tools and process.
That's what I found.
Susie, to understand how you ended up here, can you give me a sense of your path to who you are today? Typically, I like to start around when someone's going into college or into the workforce. What did that path look like to today? And you had mentioned, I think your mother, your grandmother were teachers, so I can imagine that had some influence on you. But what did your path look like from around, when you're a teenager going into college again or the workforce to now? What did that look like?
Well, what's coming up for me is I'm trying to think whether to start with college. If I start with college, my freshman year of undergrad I was an English major with a business minor. And it's interesting to me how that has played out in my career because my English background has been brought very strongly into my career because now I'm a published author. Education has strong connections with communicating effectively. And yet I was interested in business even from the very moment I walked into college. And although it took, more than 20 years before I became an entrepreneur and have now learned significantly more about business than I did when I was a nonprofit employee, I had that interest even then. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Where do you
And
think that interest came from for business?
Even as an English major, I was always fascinated by the practicalities of communication. I was less drawn to fiction. For example, I've never been interested in fiction writing for myself, even though I do enjoy reading fiction. I read at least as many business books as I do novels. But I've always been interested, and even in college, I was interested in essays. I really liked the practical nature of taking words and using them for a specific purpose. And so that combination of the art of words and the beauty of words and the connection of words and the strategy around business have always been part of my DNA as a learner, and they make up my business now. So it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that connection in a while. So thanks for bringing that out.
That's my thing. All right.
You're good.
So go ahead. So college, drawn towards English
Okay,
and business.
So and fortunately, my parents always encouraged me to follow what my joy was. And I always loved writing. I always loved creating. And the very first job I got out of college I was an editorial assistant at a small book publisher in Austin, Texas. They're called ProEd Inc. And they publish books and materials for people with disabilities. So I was an editorial assistant there for several years. And there I would prepare manuscripts for production. I would proofread books. And that job transitioned to my next role where I was an editor at the time, a large K-12 publisher. It was called Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston at the time. I believe they've been bought out many times since, but they were a large national textbook publisher. And this is actually kind of funny to me now, but I was in the English department on the GUM team, the grammar, usage, and mechanics team, the GUM team. And so
it's like Black Ops.
Oh, you better watch out. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I picture.
So it's funny to me now that, I don't know. It was funny to me then too, actually. But in that role, I actually edited grammar textbooks. Who grows up thinking that's going to be their job? But I actually always loved grammar. Even when I was in 6th grade was the first time I ever took a grammar class, and I loved it. I think it's because, again, it's the practicality combined with the art of words. I always loved that. And so I did that job for several years and then moved to Minnesota and got that role because I was the production manager on a history curriculum Northern Lights. But this is the history curriculum that this is the teacher's guide for it. It's evolved since I worked there. This was in 2013, I believe this came out, but this is the curriculum that's used throughout Minnesota to teach Minnesota studies to sixth graders. And I worked with this curriculum very closely for 15 years. And in the end, oversaw this was the latest revision. And this meets state mandated benchmarks for instruction at the sixth grade level around history, economics, geography, and civics.
Wow.
And it was my role to take what was formerly a very successful history curriculum, but then infuse all of those different disciplines into it. So I oversaw a highly collaborative multi-year effort that interviewed teachers, students, reading specialists, Dakota and Ojibwe elders, history specialists in all industries, even people working in different industries, government officials. We talked to so many people about how to shape this curriculum and made strategic decisions as a team about how to shape the content to meet the new benchmarks. So I was the lead on that. I was the project coordinator and then the lead writer and editor on the teacher's edition, which is what I was just showing you. So I did that. And then also once we completed that project, then I was the lead salesperson to travel around the state and teach teachers how to use the new version. And I loved that. That was just a joy. I love K-12 teachers. Well, these were all middle school. These were all sixth grade teachers. But I love teachers. I loved being in the classroom. And they loved the curriculum. So it was really fun to get to work with them and see how they were implementing it in classrooms throughout the state. And so those are the skills, the writing, curriculum design, and then leading workshops are the skills that I now transferred into when I started my own business. I now just take those same skills and use them with business leaders who are purpose-driven.
So what did that look like when you started thinking about going out, launching your own business? When was that seed planted? How long did it take from like, maybe I can do it to, okay, we're doing it? What did that transition look like?
It's been a slow process, and I should give the context that I am not a huge risk taker. I've always been the kind of person, I was just telling a friend of mine this the other day. My mother used to tell my brother and me that if there were a group of kids on the playground, he would just rush in and start playing, and I would sit back and watch for a while before I would enter into the group. But so that can provide context for my story, which is to say, I have just taken it one phase at a time. So I would say my transition from employee to business owner started with actually a real painful time in my life when a job that I loved, and I can still talk with enthusiasm about the projects I did when I worked at the Minnesota Historical Society. I loved that job. It was my whole network. It had become my identity. And as I have since learned, I think I didn't have enough healthy boundaries around where my identity started and where that job started. And so this happens to a lot of people, but I ended up hitting a glass ceiling. And I found that a job that once was filled with possibility, now I was hearing no a lot. And I had discovered Jonathan Fields' podcast called The Good Life Project. And he interviews various entrepreneurs doing creative, innovative, fulfilling work. And it was the first time I started to think, could I start a business? But I sat back and watched for a while. So there was I would say at least a 2-year phase where all I did was join his community. At the time, it was a Facebook group. Well, they still have one, but I watched and learned and talked to people on the Facebook group for 2 years. And I attended one of his in-person events. But I often tell people who are just starting a business, don't undervalue this phase of, if you're in a similar place where all you can do right now is just watch and learn and you don't feel like you're doing anything, don't be hard on yourself, because that's a real valid phase. And for me, it was too. So that was about 2 years. Then I took the next phase, which was I left my long-term job and took another full-time position, but that just never felt right. I was only there for about 5 months before I left. And by that time I learned a lot, though, in that 5-month period about my own skills as an instructional designer and how valuable they were, because I was in a new context now and I saw my own strength in ways I had forgotten how to in a very familiar environment that I've been in for years. So I don't know if that resonates with any of your listeners, but I had to get out first.
So even in the environment, and you had mentioned you had hit a glass ceiling at the Historical Society, but even in that job where you were fired up, passionate, and it was evident just the way you reacted and talking about it a couple minutes ago, you lost some of what you found later in a job that you left after 5 months.
Yeah. I mean, I would say the key thing I learned in that 5-month period of thinking I was going to work full time at another place, the key aha for me during that phase was, wow, education is a powerful skill. And I always knew it mattered. I always believed in its importance. But what the missing link for me was, at the Historical Society, I was surrounded by other highly skilled educators. So, and the Minnesota Historical Society is a wonderful place. At the time I was there, the museum had 70 people in the education department alone. It's one of the largest historical societies in the nation, so they're well known in the history circles, but I was surrounded by educators. So it wasn't until I was out of that environment working in more of a business corporate setting that I was like, being an educator is a unique, marketable skill. This isn't just something everyone's good at. I was stunned.
That's awesome, though.
It felt kind of funny to me now when I think
Well, I mean,
about
that
it.
just shows you how often it takes stepping outside of the usual environment, especially if there's a lot of similar people in that environment. Stepping outside of that gives you perspective on what it looks like against those who aren't like that way, or who don't operate in that manner in that field. It's amazing how valuable it is to really step outside of that comfort zone, of that familiarity, and see something different. That way you can kind of gauge the impact, the real impact of your group versus the layman, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely. It was critical for me seeing my own value. Wow. And it also then exposed me to different people than I would have been exposed to before, which then led to my next phase, which was I spent maybe a year and a half as a hired gun at instructional design agencies. There are a couple of these in the Twin Cities area. And I was simply I was simply a contractor, but that was still a big jump for me because I was technically self-employed. Even though I wasn't bringing in the clients, I was no longer an employee. So that was a phase where I learned what that's like. And I also had steady work coming in and learned a lot about what it's like to be a contractor. And then from there, I started to gain my own clients. And then the next phase was a long phase because I now say that from 2017 until about 2023, I now call phase 1 of my business. And I consider myself to be entering into what I now call phase 2. And the difference is, in phase 1, I was a freelancer and I traded dollars for hours. And I had a lot still to learn about what it means to be an entrepreneur, what it means to niche down, what it means to own my own value. And now that I'm entering what I call phase 2, I am understanding the value of being more efficient with my time and scaling and reaching more people. And I'm actually doing for myself now what I do for clients, which is I've been at this long enough now that I have what I call my own method. And I'm packaging my own method just like I do for clients. And that's in process as I continue my client work.
See, what's great about that journey is you're still learning. So
Always.
you're getting the job done, you're doing the business, but now you're at a point where you're refining it. You're living it differently. There's something about like that first phase of any business or career where you're learning and trial and error. And you may still come across trial and errors. Obviously, it's always going to happen. But there's something to be said about reaching that second phase where it's like, okay, you're not just learning, you're not just thinking, but you're learning about your learning. You're thinking about your thinking. Now you can step outside because you've built so much and see, okay, how can I now tweak and refine and streamline what I've built? So that's exciting.
And it's still a creative process because ultimately I'm a creative. And some things that have surprised me along the way are that even systematizing, which is what I'm doing in my business now, isn't taking away my creativity. It's actually adding to it. And had you told me that when I started my business, in fact, some people did, and I wasn't ready to hear that message yet. I felt like, don't box me in. And now I see that a narrower, more targeted version of what I do that in fact has systems is really allowing me to be more creative because I'm not spending as much time kind of what I'd say wasting energy trying to solve every problem. And this is common. I think it's a common evolution that you hear small business owners talk about. I just needed to go through it for myself. And so now I'm thrilled to learn some of these lessons. And and I think it's fun.
It's that freedom through discipline paradigm. The more disciplined you are, the less inefficient you are. Yes, the less inefficient you are. The more energy you have, the more time you have that allows you to create, that allows you to think, that allows you to process. That's a great example. I love that example.
Thank you.
So we've made it to the present, right?
That's it. Yeah, that my life just flashed through my eyes, flashed before my eyes.
Hopefully in a good way. I'm assuming in a good way.
No.
Suzi, does it make sense from your childhood then that this is where you are and this is what you're doing? I always love asking people that question because I'm curious about who someone is as a child and what aspects, what attributes they've brought forward. So how do you reconcile between who you are now, what you're doing versus who you were as a child?
That is fascinating. And I'm so appreciating your skills as an interviewer. It's really fun to talk to you.
I appreciate that.
You're expanding my point of view and ways to think about things. So this is so enjoyable. So thank you.
I appreciate that.
I would say, well, here's what I think back to. Until I was in 4th grade, I lived in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is kind of, my mom used to joke that we lived out in the sticks, but we lived on a cul-de-sac that met up to miles of county land. And as a kid, I just remember running around outside all the time. I was a super tomboy. We used to there was an arroyo behind our house and just miles and miles. And I can remember just wandering around for hours just on my own with my brother or with our neighbor kids who lived next to us on the cul-de-sac. But I was completely comfortable exploring. I had a strong sense of autonomy and curiosity. And I was kind of rough and tumble, I guess you would say. And so I would say that has transferred. I see connections to myself as a business owner now that I love to explore, and I'm not always afraid to try new things. And yet, in between though, I think there were a lot of years where I learned and adopted people-pleasing habits that are often trained into women. I think in a nonprofit environment, I was trained to say yes to everything and prove myself over and over and put mission above my own growth. And so I've had to unlearn, and I don't fault anyone that I worked with for that. I believe this is a wider societal issue. And yet I've had to unlearn a lot of those people-pleasing habits that I don't recall having to worry about much when I was a kid, just running around in the arroyo behind our house.
So there's before you had mentioned, that your brother at the playscape, he would just go in and jump in with whoever, and you were more risk averse. So this rough and tumble period, your quote, not mine, this was before that, and then you kind of grew into that risk averse mindset. I mean, obviously this is way before the workplace, because you just said rough and tumble. I like getting into it. I'm like, wait, this isn't the same girl that was at the playground standing back. To me, it makes sense, because when you were younger with your brother and your neighbor kids, maybe it's a smaller group, so you got into stuff. But then when you got to that point in the playground, it opens up the group. It's not just the three of you or the four of you. So it's a little different. And when we're younger, we just kind of jump into whatever it may be, most people. And then when we get a little older, we start getting inside of our heads.
I think that's a really astute observation. And you've got me thinking about how that all played out and exactly when those things occurred, because I think in some ways those two ideas aren't mutually exclusive, and in some ways they may be. So, for example, when I think back to before fourth grade, when I was still in New Mexico, I think I trusted my body. I've always been kind of athletic, and I didn't feel unsafe in my own skin. And so when I say rough and tumble, I mean that, like, I didn't live with fear. And I trusted that I'd be able to, wherever we went, I'd be able to handle it.
How old are we talking here?
I think this would have been we lived there from the time I was 2 until fourth grade. So I'm thinking like second, third grade.
That makes sense.
But yet, even during that time, well, you know what? At that time, I was a real leader too. I can remember coming home. So I think maybe you're right. Maybe the shyness started after I moved. So then we moved to Texas, and in fourth grade, there was a real transition for me. And I remember being very shy and not wanting to make a scene. I remember one time in fourth grade, for whatever reason, there wasn't a chair at my desk, and I sat at my knees for the entire class, and the teacher came over after class, and they were like, you've been sitting on your knees this whole time?
Yeah.
And I just never said a peep, and I think I was just scared to stand out. And so somehow I think the transition might have occurred when we moved.
And it all depends where you're living, where you're going to school, how long you've been there. Did you know those kids beforehand? Because it's interesting, my own experiences growing up, what I understand of growing up, and then watching my kids and the phases they're going through, the younger phases where it's like they're just out to have fun. They don't care what's going on. They're just impulsive. And then my older one, now he's getting into the age where they're considering like sociology. They're looking at the group, and do they feel accepted? Do they not? That's when you start getting in your head at that age. So that's the only reason I asked that. But
Interesting.
yeah, all those things are a good mix of, what got you to today, being not risk averse, but cautious. Those 2 years you spent kind of hovering and working within that Facebook group. I think it's a good balance.
Yeah, I think so. I do. And I recognize that some people have more comfort with risk than I do, and they're like the go big or go home types. And I definitely encourage people to listen to their own instincts about what works for them. However, I do have a problem with the prevalence of online programs that make promises of getting rich quick, because I can't think of a single business owner that I know who just went from zero to $200,000 in 3 months kind of a situation. It takes time, and there are a lot of factors you have to put together when you're starting a business. So I encourage, one of my big values is authenticity. I like to tell people how it really has been for me, and without saying it has to be exactly like this for you. I also am very committed to not continuing a narrative like, oh, you're just going to wake up tomorrow and everything's going to be easy.
Yeah, absolutely.
It does. Business ownership is a long haul, but I also want to disrupt notions that business has to be only terrifying, because the way I look at it, now that I've been a business owner for a number of years, I think back to being an employee, and in some ways it's riskier to have someone else be in complete control of your time, your talent, your income, and in some ways your wellness. That to me feels riskier than getting to control those things. But I also have to acknowledge that I have had family support and the ability to take some of these risks, which I know is a privilege as well. So I just like to talk about the nuances of all of this, and I love your interest in digging deep into these ideas too.
Yeah, that's that comparison between being your own boss and working for someone else. It's like almost for me, the last consideration is working for somebody else. I don't have an issue having a boss, but what are they doing with my time? What are they doing with my passion? What are they doing with the fire, ambition, all of that stuff? So it's not even answering to somebody, because we've all had bosses that were tuned into, okay, this person that I'm overseeing, their development is my responsibility. I want to be a multiplier of leadership. I want to make sure that they have what they need. Where I think we just get so soured by some of the bosses that we have. But that's a good comparison, is just thinking about what you want as an entrepreneur versus the job. But yeah, you don't want somebody to be sloppy or disorganized with, again, like you said, your health, your livelihood, all that plays into it. I think people have more control about certain things than they know. Like maybe most bosses just think my management stops or my leadership stops at them doing their work. And they don't think about the way that I treat them impacts them as a person and ripples out into whatever world they go into when they leave work. Like there's more of an impact, I think, than most managers, bosses, supervisors, leaders know.
Absolutely, and it's a very specialized skill that not all managers are equipped to do, and they're experiencing their own pressures. But it just breaks my heart to see across industries how prevalent it is that employees they just experience carelessness around their own time, talent,
Oh yeah.
wellness, and money.
Yeah.
And there are a variety of reasons for that, but I just got to a point where I didn't trust working for someone else anymore, because part of it is I have such a strong sense of my own fire that
Yeah.
I am very interested in using my own creativity and seeing what I can do. But it's just such a common scenario for a variety of reasons. One of the pains that I want to help solve in the world is people feeling a fire and not being blocked from using it. They have medicine, and for whatever reason they're disallowed from sharing that medicine. I want to help stop that from happening. So
Absolutely.
that's one of my missions with Teach Your Thing. And now, granted, most of my clients have been in business long enough that they have some sort of method. So I don't always work with new businesses, but sometimes I do. So most of my clients are not in that, what I would consider when I was in a fear state around my business and really terrified to leave a job. Most of my clients have been in business for a while, long enough that they they already know what they're teaching. It's just a matter of shaping it in a new way. But I very much relate to and want to support people who are feeling that fear state because I've lived it myself.
Now, Suzi, we spent so much time on your background, me just asking questions, follow-ups and follow-ups. And you've spoken to leadership. We've spoken to leadership. Is there anything else you want to share about what leadership means to you?
Well, I would say, and you know what? I didn't even hold up my own book yet, did I? Oh my goodness.
Oh,
It was
the next
here.
question goes into the book.
Here we go.
Trust me, it's going to happen.
Okay. Well, I was going to mention the book and just say, to me, leadership is truly about combining mission and money. That's been I can get more into that since you're going to ask more questions about it. But because of my own personal story, I'm very passionate about that particular intersection in leadership. So I guess I'll just pause there and see what you're going to ask about the book.
That's good. That's a good tie-in. And the next question is typically, can you introduce the book that we're going to be discussing? Obviously, at this point, it is your book. Can you go into the book, introduce it with the title and what led up to its writing?
So I'm always about visual aids. It's part of my world as an educator. I like people to see what I'm thinking. So Big-Hearted Entrepreneur, Own Your Worth and Amplify a Mission That Matters is something that I'm so proud of. And it just came out last fall, in the fall of 2023. I initially started writing it because I experienced a traumatic event that became a catalyst for me saying, I have a story to tell, and I need to, if I don't turn this trauma into something that helps other people, it would be a true missed opportunity. And it just so happened that horrible event connected to ideas that I was already developing and working on and had written about in my work as an entrepreneur. So I guess I'll get into it. In 2020, smack dab in the middle of the pandemic, I got a call from the FBI. And people now say to me, how'd you know it was really the FBI? Honestly, I kind of wish it hadn't been, because it in fact was a special agent with the Minneapolis FBI. And she said at the time, I am investigating a case and I believe you may be a victim. Can I ask you some questions? And that introduced me to what I now know. That was my very first introduction to any of this. Fast forward to now, at the time, my financial advisor, he is now in prison because he stole all of my retirement. And that the nest eggs of about 25 other people, don't quote me on the exact number, but I ended up giving a victim impact statement at his sentencing. I watched a federal magistrate judge sentence him to 7 years in prison, of which he's serving less time, which is common, I've learned. But in my case, having my literal wealth stolen from me led me to trauma therapy. And I learned in trauma therapy that when you access one trauma, it's often a gateway into really what your deeper trauma is that you need to work on. And I believe that for me, the deeper pain that I'm here to discuss, and which is what got me started writing the book, is the ways that people's wealth, in terms of their time, their talent, their wellness, and their money, are taken from them in micro ways every single day. And somehow the act of having my literal wealth stolen from me in one fell swoop connected to writing I'd already been doing and thinking I'd been doing about how entrepreneurship taught me to, and this is where the own your worth part of the book comes from. For whatever reason, entrepreneurship was the thing that taught me to own my time, to own my talent, to not be afraid of wealth and think that it was only for finance bros and not little educators like me, which is messaging I had been taught and believed. So that's how it started. And people often ask about the specifics. And the answer to the question I always get is, did I get the money back? I got about 15% of it back when this individual's assets were seized by the government and distributed equally among all the victims. I got about 15% of what he took back, and likely that's all I will ever see. So there's the answer to that. And the trauma therapy certainly helped me process the emotional part of all of that, but it made me say, I'm going to turn this into something, and I want to help other people who, in various ways, their wealth has been taken from them. And for me, entrepreneurship taught me how to overcome that, which sounds kind of weird, but that all made sense in my own mind, and I wanted to write about that. And so I wrote a manuscript before I ever thought about getting it published. And so that's the not so short answer. But
no, but it gives a lot of context to what you were thinking before the FBI agent called, and then how it evolved because they called, because of subsequent trial and the case itself. So Suzi, when it comes to, and thank you for that, for sharing all that. When it comes to that, what's the general path that you take the reader on? How is it that you take the experience that you had before the FBI call, everything after the FBI call? How do you arrange that? How do you organize it? It's interesting asking a curriculum specialist, but when it comes to your book, how do you lay it out so that those kind of messages are ingrained in your reader, kind of in the best sequence?
Well, first of all, I have to give a major shout out to my publisher, Page 2 Books. They're based in Toronto, and they focus on entrepreneurs with deep purpose. But I have to say, as someone who had been an editor for years, I had served in all kinds of editorial roles throughout my career. This was the first time I got to have someone edit me, and I was excited. You often hear about authors having a hard time being edited, and I'm like, sign me up. I can't wait to have somebody do this for me after I've been doing it for others all these years. And so my substantive editor, because I'm kind of getting into the details now of the publishing process, but with Page 2, I had a substantive editor work with me, and then also a copy editor later in the process. But Kendra Ward is her name. She was my substantive editor, and she helped me shape this book. And I have to say, it was fascinating to see the evolution, because I came to this contract with the publisher already having written a 60,000 word manuscript. And what was fascinating to me is how that manuscript drastically changed during the publishing process. First of all, they were like, we got to get this narrowed down to 40,000, which is where we ended up, because we know entrepreneurs are busy. We want it to be tight, easy, light read. And I think I hope your listeners find, if they're interested in the book, that it's a very warm, light read. That was very intentional. And what's also fascinating to me is how in the initial manuscript, the very first sentence started with the call from the FBI. By the time we did all the substantive editing work, that became much less important. And now the theft, the fraud that I was a victim of, only appears maybe in about 3 paragraphs in a 20-chapter book. And it only comes in the middle. And while I was in the process of publishing my book, or working on the book with the publisher, I was also in trauma therapy. And the trauma therapist said, what your goal is with me is what I call integration. And she said, often when someone is a victim of crime, because this is fascinating to me now, this therapist and this therapy practice that I ended up working with, their entire focus is victims of crime. Until this experience, I did not know there are people who, there are whole therapy organizations that only focus on crime victims. But she said, often when this happens to us, at first the crime is either so big that it becomes all we can think about or talk about, or we don't want to talk about it, so we diminish it, and that's not integrated into your life. And she's like, so my goal with you is to get to a place where you get to control how you tell this story, and the size, the timing, and it's up to you. There's no one right or wrong way. But as I was going through the process of integrating my own experience, I was working on writing the book, and Kendra was really helping me shape it. And we ended up in the place where the book is now, which is, it's not a book about how I processed being a crime victim. It doesn't help you deal with fraud. It really gets at that deeper issue, which I think appeals and applies to way more people, which is, how can you use entrepreneurship, as I did, as a way to own your own worth and amplify a mission? So the own your worth part is really the process that I went through as an entrepreneur to own my value. And I'd already been writing about that, but it's just that the crime made me more passionate about sharing my ideas and made me trust that I had a voice. I think in a way, because being a crime victim makes you feel so silenced. It makes you feel so betrayed. It makes you feel so violated that I felt even more of a sense of, I have a voice. I've got something to say. Let's go. It's on. And it's not about me. It's about a broader experience that applies to a lot of people. So that's where we ended up. And the first part is about the kind of internal work I had to do to become an entrepreneur, to own my value. And then the second part is about really more about the practical strategies I teach as a learning strategist. So the Amplify a Mission That Matters is the second part. And in that I just talk about different ways that you can, different structures, different containers you can use to tell about your own mission. And along the way, Kendra suggested, she said, okay, first we need to get your thesis down. Now that your thesis is down, we've got your story down. Now that your thesis and your story are down, now bring in the stories of others. So I then interviewed what turned out to be 17 other entrepreneurs who are mission driven, and I weave their stories into the book too. So it's not just about me, but it's a very practical guide for those two things: owning your mission, owning your worth and amplifying a mission. So
Suzi,
that's my long way of explaining that.
No, it's all right. In those two parts of the book, can you give a couple examples of the chapters, just so somebody can get kind of a sense for what the chapters might hold?
That is an excellent question. I'm just going to, so in Own Your Worth, we have Get to Know Your Personal Medicine. So that's about really identifying what is your uniqueness that you can bring to the world. Protect Your Energy. That's huge and was deeply undervalued, and especially in my work as a nonprofit employee. And we hear so much about productivity and time efficiency, but energy is equally important, and we have to protect it ferociously and with love for ourselves. So that's one. I've got Choose Mission and Money, and then Pay Attention to Your Wealth. And that is really for people like me who I just always believed wealth wasn't for me as an educator, as a woman, as a do-gooder. And I've learned to let go of some of those limiting beliefs. So that's part one. Those are some. And then some from part two, Amplify a Mission That Matter. We've got Embrace Authenticity Over Perfection. It's one of the chapters. I've got Facilitate Dialogue. And in that chapter, I talk about one of my business pet peeves is the phrase, put yourself out there. Because I think that's very one-sided. I think it implies that we have to be a perfect expert. So instead, I say facilitate dialogue instead of put yourself out there. And then I have just different ways that you can do a mission, like develop a signature talk, get your event on. So plan an event, or build a body of work. Those are some of the chapter titles.
Suzi, you've laid out the events that where the book originally, the manuscript came from, why you wanted to do it, the events that unfolded that kind of bolstered its messaging. Beautiful take on the process of writing it and kind of tweaking it along the way. Aside from those lessons, I'm curious if there are any other ways. I just want to make sure I capture them all. In what ways did writing this book, getting this book out there, change you? What lessons did you learn
Really,
just from its publishing?
I learned to trust myself more. Um, and I learned that I have something to say. But the trusting myself, I think, is the number one thing, because at every stage, and I mean every stage, from believing that I wanted to write a book to getting it published, I had challenges to, who am I to do this? And over again, I had to choose to trust in my sense that I did have something to say and that I was ready to say it. And so I could get into specifics if you want to know more, but that came up. I had to intentionally and with thought and with courage overcome the imposter syndrome at every step. But I knew in a way that I couldn't even explain to my logical brain that this was something I needed to do and it was time to do it. And I just learned to trust it.
Yeah, it's incredible because people will rib me a little on this show about it, and how I've mentioned I have lived with anxiety my entire life. That I was shy as a kid, not confident, whatever it might be, and they call bullshit on it because, oh, you have this podcast, this series you put out, you love speaking in front of large groups, um, you putting yourself on screen on this series, um, and it's amazing how that imposter syndrome can still exist. I still have my doubts about this. I'm coming up on 100 episodes of the series and still have my doubts. It hits me every time, every moment before I start and hit record with somebody. I still have that kind of fight or flight, fight or flight. Excuse me. Um, so all to say, it's not naturally that I come on here like this, but it's like an internal conversation about, you feel that discomfort, which I like that it's there because it tends to keep me on point. Like I remain a little humble. I don't want to go into it with 100% confidence level. But there is something to be said about knowing that you have something you want to put out there, but our default setting, our programming from society or whatever it may be, is, doubt yourself, is, be careful of what other people think of, be careful, you got to get that good grade, like, people are watching. So I appreciate that mention of imposter syndrome, and just that it is a regular conversation of, you feel those feelings kind of creeping up, a shadow that never goes away, but you convince yourself, you remind yourself, not even convince, you remind yourself that you do have that value that you need to put out there.
Well, congratulations on 100 episodes. And I commend you for keeping going and knowing that it's okay if you feel those little butterflies in your stomach, even every time. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing this work. And I'm so glad that you know how to keep going forward. And so I hope this conversation encourages other people who know they have a message to find whatever their container is. You have a podcast, I wrote a book. There's not just one way. I hope other people hear this and know that they can trust themselves to keep going, even though it's scary.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Just in talking about your own medicine and owning it, is that, you just have to, it's trial and error, figuring out the right platform that again, and the funny thing is, this is for me. Um, I think you had mentioned that before. I forget in what context. We've been on here like almost an hour and a half. I forget which context, but you talked about the importance of this being for me. And I forget if it was in your studies. I forget which part of your life you were talking about when you mentioned that. But it is important to, I think it was when you were talking about what you're putting out for other people, the importance of doing it for yourself as well, and not just for the audience. I swear it's back there somewhere. Or something you said reminded me of that thought. But I think it does have to be there for you. You know, whether you're writing the book, you know, it's not just for the audience. Whether if you're doing a podcast series, it's not just for the audience because you reference, you know, congratulations on still going and still pushing forward. I think anything we do, a good part of it has to be innate drive and not just
Yes,
what's the expectation of the audience, because that's really what's going to keep you moving forward. If it's just for the audience, but you don't have that innate drive and motivation to keep going, that reward, you'll burn out just because you're trying to keep up with what you're trying to do for others.
that's right. And you're referring to the advice I give to clients when they're choosing their own containers for their body of
Mm,
work. I encourage them to think about
that's what it was.
what seems fun, what
That's
lights
what it
you
was.
up,
Yeah.
because a lot of times people will say, "Oh, well, if you don't have a book, then, forget it," or, "Oh, you got to do a podcast." But if we are choosing a container, I keep using the word container, but if we choose a format to build a body of work in because we think we should do it, but it feels like drudgery,
Mm,
don't do it. You
yeah.
need to pick something that's fun for you. And to me, writing is fun.
Yeah.
I liked it. And it was an exploration, and it was something I wanted to do. And I'm not saying that it's easy. It was hell of a lot of work. And I say that
Yeah.
it was hard work, and it was an investment. It was something I had to choose over and over. And I'm not saying there weren't times when I was like, oh my gosh, why am I doing this?
Yeah, but
But
your desire for it drives your resilience through it.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I knew it was a format that worked for me and that would be compelling, because you may have noticed I'm someone who likes to go deep. And so, for example, the thought, this sounds crazy to me, but in some ways it was easier for me to write a book than it was to ever implement social media successfully and consistently, because it's really hard for me to think about big ideas and portray them in short snippets.
Mm,
Now that I have a book and I got to go deep and really wrestle with big ideas, but again, we did it in a way that is focused on the learner and is light and easy to digest. But I had to wrestle through some big ideas. Now that I've done that, now I'm turning to doing social media consistently, and I have my assistant is helping me, and I love her for help.
yeah.
But that just doesn't come naturally to me. Doing social media doesn't come natural. I mean, I know how to. Here's what I would say: I'm great at knowing how to create a dialogue that matters. I know how to say things that matter even on social media, but doing it in small daily snippets does not come naturally to me
Well, I mean, you
at
the
all.
word you just used, dialogue, you know, and social media isn't the best dialogue. Even if you put something out and there are no trolls and everybody is posting and engaging with you and asking you questions and they really enjoy what you're doing, it's still not a dialogue. It's not the same as meeting face to face, having a virtual talk. So it makes sense that you revere and you value the dialogue, and then but still social media is kind of like, it just seems like one way, I guess.
I don't know. I think it can be done well. People who do social media do well do it as a dialogue, and I think social media should be a dialogue, and I've seen it done effectively, and I know people who do it effectively. And I actually would like to think that now that I'm in the habit of doing it more regularly, I'm doing it in a way that creates dialogue. But but especially when people are just getting started building their body of work, I absolutely encourage you to choose the medium that works for you. Because, for example, it's so funny. I have a girlfriend that we often do like a point counterpoint to each other because our styles are different. And she loves social media. In fact, it gives her hives to think about going really deep like I did. She just, what energizes her is she's like, I can just go in there quick. I can just say what's on my mind and hit send. And that gives me hives. I'm like, ooh, that makes me nervous. But she loves it. And so that's what I want people to look for is what's the medium that you love? And obviously for you, having conversations on a podcast comes so naturally and it gives you joy. So just give yourself permission to create what you want to create, not what you think you should create. Then it can allow you to repurpose it in other ways. That's what I
absolutely
teach.
Yeah, it's better to establish the body and repurpose than worry about repurposing and not focus on that establishment of that body of work. So that's great advice. And I know it's early, but Suzi, what do you think even generally you would want to write about next? Do you have an idea of what you want to get to?
That's a good question. This, of course, could change, but I would say I would love to write a book about business models, which sounds kind of crazy to me now. And I'm not either that. So either business models, and by that, I mean, it's taken me a long time as a business owner to build a business model that isn't just trading dollars for hours. So I'm fascinated by that. And I also love the phrase, you teach what you most need to learn. So any book I would write in the future would still be about something that I really had to wrestle with for a long time and then finally saw the light. So that's why I say business models, or else I might write something that's more specific to my own instructional design process. And I'm actually working on turning my method into a curriculum.
Okay.
And so that I could see turning into a book. And the short version is when I work with clients, I help them with content, format, and behavior change. And there's a lot that happens in those three areas, but I could see writing a book about that.
Suzi, generally, I guess then, what lessons do you hope your readers take away from the book?
I hope they can see that one, business doesn't have to be about the bottom line. Two, that business doesn't have to be only for people that you associate traditional business being about. So for example, I cannot stand how many times, even in 2024, I see best business books list, and it's overwhelmingly white males. And I've curated a list of business books I've read along the way, and it certainly includes works of white males. But I really needed to hear other perspectives when I was starting my own business. So I'm proud to have contributed the message that business can be big-hearted and should be big-hearted. And also that there are practical strategies you can implement now to get your message into the world, even if you are a big visionary with lots of ideas and a big heart.
Thank you for that. Now, Suzi, we're covering your book. What books have inspired you? Is there a top book that kind of has driven you, motivated you in some way? If we were to come here again and talk about a book that's impacted and influenced you, what would that book be? I won't hold you to it.
I love this question. And by the way, on my website, teachyourthing.com, there is a list of my favorite business books because I actually curated a list of my favorites on bookshop.org. I have a store there. And I actually just established this because I was recommending a business book to my accountant. And he's like, oh, you should start a list on Bookshop where you recommend books. And so I've been doing that ever since. So you'll see on that list, I love Rachel Rogers' book, We All Should Be Millionaires. She is a Black woman business owner who has created and helped others. She's created at least a 7-figure business and has coached many others to do the same. And she writes what I loved about her book is that it was the first time I had ever read a business book where the author outright acknowledged guilt that you can feel around building a business and having other people work for you and not seeing that as exploitation. Because I had read, and there are popular business books that we hear about all the time that, like, well, I won't mention any of those by name, but they talk about, they kind of, in my opinion, they talk about your goal as a business owner is to work fewer and fewer hours and make more and more money, which now I'm more in tune with that idea. But I always would say, but somebody's doing the work, and how are they being exploited? And I never wanted to be someone who exploited other people. And Rachel Rogers was the first person to address this directly in her book and talk about it in a really thoughtful way. And at the simplest, she says, if you don't want to exploit other people, then don't. But she also then talks very specifically about how you can honor the people. She's like, give people time off, pay them well. And I'm oversimplifying her message because it's a lot more nuanced, but I love her book. And it's a real women's empowerment, empowering people of color. It's a great book. That's one. I could choose others too. There's so many. I would also say The Soul Sourced Entrepreneur by Christine Kane. That book makes you feel like you're being spoken to by a best friend. And she talks about what it's like to feel strong emotions as you're building your business. And she has a lot of practical strategies. So I love that book too. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Suzi, in wrapping up, what are you up to these days? Is there anything else that you want to share that I haven't asked about that you want to share with this audience to get out there? Floor's yours.
Well, I would say I would love for you to visit my website, teachyourthing.com. And if you are wanting to create your own talk or workshop or course, and you have a method that you want to amplify that and spread to more people, and you're looking for a learning strategy coach, you can go on the website and hit up my contact page, or you could follow me on LinkedIn under Suzi Hunn, or on Instagram under Teach Your Thing. And just to encourage you to keep talking about what matters to you and not feel like you have to only care about the bottom line, because we're really become part of this movement with me to build a more human economy. And I'm also building a group program. There are lots of different ways that people can access my coaching, from one-on-one coaching to a group program that I'm launching, to you can buy the book, Big Hearted Entrepreneur, which you can find on any online marketplace for books, whatever your favorite one is. I like Bookshop because it supports indie bookstores, but you can find it on any online marketplace for books.
And again, Suzi's book is Big Hearted Entrepreneur, Own Your Worth and Amplify a Mission That Matters. Suzi, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for everything you shared.
Thank you. I'm honored and so enjoyed the conversation. And I can't wait to connect with your learners if they reach out.
Absolutely. And if there's anything that I might have missed, there's so much to cover, and I've kept Suzi here going at 1 hour and 40 minutes. And I truly do feel like there's more to be asked. Let me know. I'll reach out to her, see what kind of knowledge, insights, information she can provide. Until next time, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.